If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or mocked for your struggles, this story will resonate deep in your soul. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe because stories of redemption like this one don't come around every day. This journey of a single father fighting battles both seen and unseen might just change how you view strength forever. The first time I saw James Parker in action, I couldn't believe my eyes. One moment, he was this quiet, unassuming dad in worn-out jeans dropping his daughter off at school. The next, he was moving with such precision and deadly focus that the schoolyard fell silent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the day when our small town of Millfield first met the man who would redefine what it means to be strong. James Parker moved to Millfield with his 8-year-old daughter Emma after his wife lost her 3-year battle with aggressive lymphoma. Sarah Parker had been the center of their universe, a kindergarten teacher beloved by her students, a community volunteer, and the kind of mother who made homemade Halloween costumes and remembered every child's birthday in Emma's class. Her death left a void that seemed impossible to fill, especially for James, who had promised her in their final moments together that he would give Emma the life they had always dreamed of for her. The two of them arrived in Millfield on a crisp autumn day, their small U-Haul truck containing the remnants of their previous life in Boston. They'd chosen our town specifically for its good schools and lower cost of living, allowing James to work remotely as an IT security consultant while being present for Emma. Their little blue house on Maple Street needed work. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, but within weeks, James had the place looking respectable, working late into the night after Emma went to bed. They were inseparable. You'd see them at the park, the grocery store, the library, always together, always with a kind of quiet sadness hanging over them like a thin veil. James packed Emma's lunch every morning with little notes tucked inside. He learned to braid her hair by watching YouTube tutorials, his large hands surprisingly deft at the delicate task. On weekends, they worked on the house together, Emma holding the flashlight while James fixed leaky pipes, her small voice asking endless questions that he answered with infinite patience. But being a single parent meant James existed in a strange limbo in our community. The mothers at school pickup regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. A man doing women's work was still something of an anomaly in our traditional town. The fathers, mostly married and secure in their conventional roles, didn't quite know how to include him in their conversations about sports and lawn care. James didn't seem to mind the isolation. His world had narrowed to just Emma and survival after Sarah's death. Emma started at Millfield Elementary mid-year, which is always tough for a kid. She was shy, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's thoughtful eyes. She carried a small stuffed rabbit everywhere, the last gift from her mom, given on the day Sarah had to enter hospice care. The rabbit, named Mr. Hoppy, wore a tiny hand-knitted scarf that Sarah had managed to make during her final weeks. Emma would whisper to it during class when she thought no one was looking, telling its secrets meant for her mother's ears. The other kids, being kids, didn't know how to react to her grief, so most just avoided her. Children can sense difference like sharks sense blood in water, and Emma's loss made her different in a way that made them uncomfortable. All except for Darren Mercer's son, Tyler. Tyler Mercer was the kind of kid who made teachers sigh heavily when they saw his name on their class roster. At 10 years old, he already had a reputation for cruelty disguised as humor, for finding weaknesses and exploiting them mercilessly. He wasn't entirely to blame. His father, Darren, was worse, a local real estate developer with money, influence, and the personality of a bulldozer. Darren drove a massive black SUV with custom rims that he parked across 2 spaces at the school lot. He wore expensive suits to PTA meetings where other parents came in jeans and sweaters. He donated large sums to the school with great fanfare, always ensuring the local paper covered his generosity. His son watched and learned, mimicking his father's swagger and disdain. James Parker, with his quiet demeanor, modest income, and single-parent status, became Darren's favorite target almost immediately. Here was everything Darren despised, a man who showed emotion, who prioritized his child over career advancement, who didn't posture or compete for status. In Darren's warped worldview, James was failing at masculinity and therefore deserved contempt. It started small. Darren would make loud comments at PTA meetings about real men and how kids need strong male role models. He'd deliberately bump into James in the school parking lot and not apologize. He'd interrupt James in committee discussions, talking over him as if he weren't there. Meanwhile, Tyler was making Emma's school days miserable, hiding her backpack, mocking her stuffed rabbit, telling the other kids her mom died because she wanted to get away from her. "Hey, rabbit girl," Tyler would call across the playground. "Does your dad cry himself to sleep too? My dad says he probably does." Emma would clutch Mr. Hoppy tighter and walk away, her small shoulders hunched against the verbal blows. She never told James about the bullying. She could see how hard he was trying, how tired he was at the end of each day. She'd inherited her mother's protective instinct and wanted to shield her father from more pain. But children can only endure so much. One rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, James arrived at school pickup to find Emma in tears, her precious rabbit torn apart, stuffing scattered across the wet playground. Tyler stood nearby with 3 of his friends, smirking. When James calmly asked what happened, Darren appeared, puffing out his chest like a peacock establishing territory. "Your kid needs to toughen up," Darren sneered, loud enough for the other parents to hear. "The world doesn't care about your sob story. Maybe if you weren't such a pathetic excuse for a father, playing house and doing women's work, your kid wouldn't be such a crybaby." The playground fell silent. Other parents looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Mrs. Hernandez, the principal, was inside dealing with a different crisis. James stood very still, his face expressionless as he surveyed the scene. His daughter's tears, the destroyed memento of her mother, the smug satisfaction on Darren's face. For just a moment, something flickered in James's eyes, something cold and calculating that seemed out of place on his gentle face, but it vanished so quickly that those watching thought they'd imagined it. James simply gathered Emma and the pieces of her rabbit and walked away, his arm around his daughter's shaking shoulders. "That's right, walk away," Darren called after them. "That's what I thought." That night, after Emma had finally cried herself to sleep, James sat at the kitchen table with the torn pieces of Mr. Hoppy spread before him. His hands, which had once assembled and disassembled weapons in complete darkness, which had treated battlefield wounds under enemy fire, now carefully sorted through bits of stuffing and fabric. He found Sarah's tiny stitches where she'd attached the scarf, saw how the thread had held even when the seams gave way. James stayed up until dawn, meticulously stitching the rabbit back together, adding extra reinforcement at the seams, making it stronger than before. As he worked, he thought about his wife, about the promises he'd made to her, about the kind of father he wanted to be for Emma. Violence had been part of his former life, but he'd left that behind. He'd chosen a different path. But watching his daughter suffer, seeing her most precious possession destroyed out of pure malice, tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. What none of us knew then was that James Parker wasn't just an IT consultant. Before settling into civilian life, he'd served 12 years in Delta Force, the Army's elite special operations unit. He'd been deployed to places most Americans couldn't find on a map, completed missions that would never make the history books. He'd been trained not just in combat, but in psychology, in reading people and situations, in de-escalation, and, when necessary, in swift, decisive action. He'd left that life behind when he met Sarah, wanting something quieter, something normal. Sarah had known about his past, of course. She'd helped him through the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life where threats weren't lurking around every corner. She'd loved both sides of him, the warrior and the gentle soul who could spend hours photographing butterflies in their garden. With her guidance, he'd found balance, learned to channel his training into protection rather than aggression. Now, without her, he sometimes felt himself slipping, the old instincts rising to the surface when Emma was threatened. The next morning, James presented the repaired Mr. Hoppy to Emma at breakfast. She examined it carefully, running her fingers over the new stitches, the reinforced limbs. "He's different," she said quietly. "He's stronger now. Sometimes when we break and get put back together, that's what happens. The broken places become the strongest parts of us. Emma looked up at her father, seeing something in his face that resonated with her 8-year-old understanding of loss. Like us? James nodded, his throat tight. Just like us, Em. For weeks after the playground incident, James endured Darren's taunts with stoic dignity. He helped Emma navigate Tyler's bullying with quiet guidance, teaching her that responding with anger only gives bullies what they want. He suggested she find allies, not to fight her battles, but to stand with her so she wouldn't face them alone. He taught her breathing techniques for when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, the same techniques he'd used in combat situations. Your mind is your strongest weapon, he told her. If you can control your fear, you can control any situation. Meanwhile, James began integrating himself into the school community in ways that were hard to ignore. He volunteered at school events despite the whispers and stares, showing up with homemade cookies that put the store-bought contributions to shame. He fixed the ancient computer system in the school library for free when the district said there wasn't budget for it. When the 5th grade science fair needed judges, he stepped in, revealing a depth of knowledge that surprised the teachers. He never mentioned his military background. When asked about his skills, his knowledge of physics that helped the science teacher explain complex concepts, his first aid expertise that came in handy when a child fell on the playground, he would simply shrug and say he'd picked things up over the years. He didn't want to be defined by his past, didn't want to be seen as anything other than Emma's dad. Slowly, people began to see him differently. Parents started inviting Emma for playdates. Teachers commented on James's patience and dedication. Mothers who had initially kept their distance began asking his advice on home repairs or computer problems. He became known for his calm competence, his willingness to help without expecting recognition. Everyone except Darren Mercer, whose antagonism only grew as James gained acceptance. It seemed to infuriate Darren that this quiet single father could earn respect without demanding it, could parent effectively without conforming to Darren's rigid ideas of masculinity. As James's standing in the community rose, Darren's attacks became more pointed, more public. At a town council meeting where James presented a proposal for updating the school's outdated emergency response system, Darren openly mocked him. "Listen to G.I. Joe here, thinking he knows about safety," Darren sneered. "Stick to baking cookies and leave the real decisions to people who understand how the world works." James simply continued his presentation, outlining vulnerabilities in the current system and offering cost-effective solutions. The council voted unanimously to adopt his recommendations, with several members praising his thoroughness. Darren stormed out before the vote was finalized. The situation came to a head at the school's annual fall festival in October, 6 months after the Parkers had moved to town. The event was Millfield Elementary's biggest fundraiser, with carnival games, food stalls, and activities spread across the school grounds. James had volunteered to run the ring toss booth, and Emma was finally starting to come out of her shell, playing with a small group of friends who had gradually warmed to her quiet intelligence and dry humor. Darren had been drinking from a flask he poorly concealed in his jacket, growing louder and more obnoxious as the evening progressed. He'd made several passes by James's booth, making comments just loud enough for nearby parents to hear, but not quite loud enough to justify intervention. As the festival wound down and families began heading home, James was closing down his booth, counting tickets and packing away prizes. Emma and her new friends, Lily, Marcus, and Zoe, were helping, carefully placing the colorful rings in storage boxes. They were laughing about something, and the sound of Emma's laughter, still rare enough to be precious, made James pause in his counting, a smile softening his features. It was in this unguarded moment that Darren approached, Tyler trailing behind him with the same smirk his father wore. "Must be nice to have all this free time to play games while real men are working. What kind of example are you setting? Your daughter's going to grow up thinking men are supposed to be soft." The children fell silent, tension immediately replacing their laughter. James straightened up slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of the situation. Darren's intoxication level, Tyler's anticipatory expression,
the position of his daughter and her friends, the nearest adults who might intervene or witness what happened next. "Emma," James said calmly, "why don't you and your friends take those boxes to Mrs. Hernandez? Tell her we're all done here." Emma hesitated, looking between her father and Darren with worried eyes. "Dad—" "It's okay, Em. We're just going to talk. Adult stuff. Boring." He gave her a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The children gathered the boxes and moved away reluctantly, Emma glancing back over her shoulder until they turned the corner of the building. James continued packing up, his movements methodical and calm. "I appreciate your concern for my daughter's upbringing, Darren, but we're doing just fine." "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you're raising a weak little girl who cries over a stupid toy, just like her weak father." Darren stepped closer, invading James's personal space. "Everyone in town knows you're a joke, playing Mr. Mom because you can't hack it in the real world. What kind of man bakes cookies and braids hair? It's pathetic." Something in James's posture changed then. It was subtle, a slight shift in his weight, a new awareness in his eyes as they scanned the area, noting the position of every person, every exit, every potential weapon or obstacle. Anyone with military training would have recognized the change immediately. This was a man moving from condition yellow to condition orange, from relaxed awareness to focused readiness. "I'm going to ask you once to walk away," James said quietly. "You've had too much to drink, and there are children present. We can discuss your concerns about my parenting another time if you're really interested." Darren laughed, a harsh sound that drew attention from nearby parents who were packing up their own booths. "Oh, what? You'll cry about it? Maybe call your mommy? Oh, wait, your kid doesn't have one of those." The change that came over James's face then was like watching storm clouds gather over a peaceful landscape. His expression didn't shift toward anger as most would expect. Instead, it emptied of all emotion, becoming a blank canvas that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. "You don't want to do this," James said, his voice so low that Darren had to lean in to hear him. "Not here, not now. Walk away, Mercer." Perhaps it was the alcohol, or perhaps it was months of building resentment, but Darren made the critical error of mistaking James's restraint for weakness. He reached out and shoved James's shoulder hard enough to make him step back. "What are you going to do about it, Parker, huh? What are you going to—" It happened so fast that those of us watching barely registered the movement. One second, Darren was standing there, mid-sentence. The next, he was on his knees, his arm twisted behind him at an angle that made several mothers gasp. James had moved with such fluid precision, it was like watching water flow around a rock. No wasted motion, no telegraphing of intent, just pure, efficient action. "My daughter," James said, in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent playground, "is stronger than you will ever understand. She has faced loss that would break most adults, and she gets up every day with courage and kindness. I won't have you or your son teaching her that bullies win." He released Darren, who fell forward onto his hands, gasping. James hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a punch, but something in his eyes made Darren scramble backward, suddenly aware that he had grossly miscalculated the man before him. "You're crazy," Darren sputtered, his face red with